Oh, yes, this is joint work between Columbia and IBM. Unfortunately, Jingwei couldn't be here today, but hopefully I can present this work well enough. So our objective here is to take advantage of the fact that there are many measures of word relatedness. So there's manually constructed lexical resources, and there's also distributional approaches, topic-based approaches, all these different automatic methods of relating words to other words. And we want to produce a continuous word representation that at a minimum can distinguish between synonyms and antonyms, which distributional vector spaces are notoriously poor at. And our big motivating idea here is that these resources for word relatedness can be very complementary. So the manual resources are going to get at the interesting relationships. That's really why they were created. Is people wanted this relationship enough that they had some annotators produce this. But automatic methods get you that high coverage, get you the long tail of infrequent terms, and without extensive human effort. So our approach is Bayesian probabilistic matrix factorization, which is a technique that was developed for collaborative filtering. This was actually introduced originally as Bayesian probabilistic matrix factorization, where the matrix is users and items, and you essentially want to do something like matrix completion. You want to know what rating each user would give for each item with only a sparse input. And this was then extended to take different time slices into consideration. This forms the third dimension, transforming the matrix into a tensor. And this produced very good results on recommendation data sets. So the hypothesis behind our adaptation here is that there's some latent set of word vectors, and that these various word relatedness measures are constructed through these latent vectors. And each of these word relatedness measures has some associated perspective vector. So we're going to represent its view on the latent word vectors also through a vector. Combining these, all three things together, reconstructs this relatedness tensor, but of course there's also some noise involved in this reconstruction. So just the basics. So the approach is generative. So the idea is that our model assigns some probability to the data. And we're Bayesian here, so we also have a prior. So we have the model assigning some probability to the data, prior for the model, that gives us the probability of the model given the data. And rather than just taking the maximum likelihood estimation or something like that, again, with a Bayesian approach, we're going to average in the predictions from our models according to how probable they are. So that's the Bayesian probabilistic part. Now for the TF, the tensor factorization aspect, the idea is that we have this input tensor, three-way tensor, word, perspective. The entries in that are the result of three vectors, essentially a kind of multiplication, an extended dot product, and that gives the observed tensor. So our tensor input is, as I said, multiple measures of word relatedness. So for example, we may have a slice of this tensor, a matrix, that's lexical similarity. And this is just saying we have a 1 for every synonym, a -1 for every antonym pair, and most of the entries are actually missing. So we actually have another thing, an indicator tensor that's giving us whether the entry is present or not. So another slice of the tensor could be something like distributional similarity, where each of these is like the cosine similarity of these distributional vectors, for example. And so if you take these two word-by-word matrices, just to pin them together, you end up with a three-way tensor, lexical similarity, and then distributional similarity. Our model here is that the tensor is generated from the set of latent vectors and the latent perspective vector with some Gaussian noise. So this entry in our relatedness tensor ijk comes from the word vector for I, the word vector for j, and the perspective k. And that's the mean of the normal distribution that's generating this data. And then there's some also a variance parameter. And the combination function here is just a generalization of dot product. So we're going to go through the dimensions of these vectors, multiply them together outwise, sum it up, just like dot product, but with 3 vectors. Okay, so this is giving us the probability of the data given the model. And now we just need to find the prior probability. So this is actually all there is to the probability of the data given the model. And then the next slides are just our priors. Our prior on the word vectors is just a Gaussian prior. It's actually a family of priors. So there's some unknown mean vector for words and some unknown variance matrix. And similarly for the perspective vectors, it's just also drawn from a Gaussian with some hyperparameter mean, which is also latent, and some variance matrix. And for our hyperparameters, so we have our mu sub v, mu sub p, and so on. And also from the previous slide, we had the variance for the Gaussian distribution of the actual relatedness tensor. These are just conjugate priors, and then we have some hyperpriors that are really insensitive, so we just set those to basic defaults. This is everything I just said, but in graphical form. So if you look from the center outwards, we see that the relatedness tensor, Rijk, is formed from the perspective vector and the 2 word vectors. That gives you the particular entry in our relatedness tensor with some Gaussian noise parameterized by alpha. And then these vectors for the words are drawn from Gaussian distribution with mean mu sub v and variance. And then those are in turn drawn from our hyperpriors. In order to do inference in this model, or in order to find the actual factorization, we use Gibbs sampling. So we're going to sample each set of parameters, holding the others fixed. So we begin by sampling the hyperparameters, these circles outside the main boxes. Then we sample the word vectors, again holding everything else fixed, so it's only being influenced by our relatedness tensor and the mean and variance. And then we sample the perspective, set of perspective vectors, and we do this repeatedly. So we're going to eventually reach the stationary distribution, and eventually it comes actually very quickly. So the burn-in period is only about 30 iterations of this. And then, after the burn-in period is complete, the things that we'll begin drawing are from our stationary distribution. So this is now an unbiased sampling of the latent word vectors and the latent perspective vectors. So we're getting models back in proportion to their probability from this sampling procedure. Okay, a key idea here is also some out-of-vocabulary embedding. And what's going on here is that we want the number of non-missing entries in each slice of the tensor, each word-relatedness matrix. Well, it's going to have a influence on the factorization proportional to the number of non-zero or number of non-missing entries. So we want the lexical similarity, the relatedness measure from our lexicon, to be sort of the dominant, or at least not be insignificant. But that one is the one that actually has the least coverage. So rather than including all of our words in this tensor factorization procedure, we actually downsample the automatic perspective substantially. So now we have a lot of words that aren't in our factorization. And in order to get those, it's actually efficient and effective to compute the Rij for those for the perspective of interest using only the word vector sampling of the Gibbs procedure, and then put in the vector, the dot product, the generalized dot product using the perspective vector. So our predictions are, like I said, from a Bayesian perspective, it's going to be the average of our different model predictions weighted by their probability. So in our Gibbs sampling procedure, we're getting back vectors, latent perspective vectors, latent word vectors that are in proportion to their probability given the data. So we can just take m samples of this and then average them together, and that gives us our generalized and regularized relatedness tensor. So for tuning, there's really only one thing to tune, and that's the number of dimensions for the latent word and perspective vectors. And we have a development set to tune that, and we chose a number of dimensions equal to 40 was our best performing. The hyperpriors are untuned, and this is something we saw from collaborative filtering that they just don't have much influence, so you can leave them at these very basic defaults. For our experimental validation, we're using a number of resources. So I mentioned that we're most interested in recreating the relatedness measures from manually constructed resources. So WordNet, Rajesh Thesaurus, and Carta Thesaurus has been used in other work, and Southern Thesaurus as well, but these are not publicly available. So we are only focusing on the WordNet and Rajesh Thesaurus. And there are many different kinds of automatic word relatedness measures. I think if you're interested in automatic semantics, you've probably seen this picture of the word vector representations where you can take the man vector away from the king vector, add in the woman vector, and you get a vector very similar to queen. What we found is better for rare words is morphologically trained word vectors. So combining the distributional similarities with some information about the morphology of these words. And that's a neural word embedding. So for evaluation, as I mentioned, we want to measure this by its ability to distinguish synonyms and antonyms, which traditional distributional similarity is very poor at. So there's this GRE test data set. It was developed by Mohammed. And it's these GRE antonym questions. It just gives you a word, no context, and gives you 5 choices of other words. And you're just asked to choose which is the antonym. So I actually did not know what the answer to this was. It has a lot of rare words. As it happens, the answer is systematic. So desultory antonym systematic. Previous work on this, you can approach this in many different ways. I mean, you don't have to use any kind of word vector representations. In fact, some early work, Len just identified antonym pairs by looking at certain patterns and grabbing through a corpus using those patterns. Others like Turney, have used supervised classification and a more general framework. So he was looking at the problem of analogies between terms more generally, and then consider antonym pairs as a particular case of that. Mohammed et al., who developed this data set that we're using, uses a number of things. So the idea of a corpus co-occurrence, that antonyms tend to occur together, let's say in a 5-word window, much more often than you would guess by chance. And the structure of a published thesaurus. So the thesaurus is giving you antonyms explicitly, but he found that there were certain patterns in the word entries that allowed him to mine additional probable antonym groups. The state of the art in this is polarity-inducing latent semantic analysis. This is just latent semantic analysis applied to a thesaurus. So view the thesaurus entry for a word as its document and give a positive 1 for every synonym and a negative 1 for every antonym. And this tends to produce word vectors that have a negative cosine similarity when they're antonyms and a positive cosine similarity when they are synonyms. Our evaluation. So, as I said, the coverage of manual resources is lacking, and especially as we look to this antonym task that includes so many rare words. So if you look at WordNet lookup, it'll depend on the specific way you do the WordNet lookup. You can get something like a 42% F measure, maybe 44% F measure in the second half, but not good. Rajay is similar, so 45% F measure just by doing lookup. Encarta is quite a bit better, so you can get 59% using Encarta. And this is the previous state of the art, the bold line in the first half. Used polarity-inducing latent semantic analysis on Encarta. So moving from 59% lookup performance to 81% F-score on the test set. Our work, we applied it to a slice using only WordNet and the morphological word embeddings discussed earlier. Moved from 44 to 62. Similar, little better improvement using Rajay's. Combining it in the morphological word embeddings with Rajay gave us 76. But we get the big improvement by combining the information from WordNet and Rajay, which together gives 55%, and that gets us to 82% F-score. So compared to the previous state of the art, moving from 59 to 81 versus 55 to 82, we're seeing a nice improvement. This is the convergence curve. As I mentioned, the number of Gibbs sampling iterations you really need to do in order for this procedure to be effective is actually very small. So the matrix factorization actually converges very quickly, and really recreates the data with actually less mean squared error, but it's actually overfitting. And then the tensor factorization, you can see it's essentially converged at 40, maybe 60 iterations. So in related work, and also you can view as a source of additional information, other word vector representations, we have core methods like latent semantic analysis, which is getting at the topic-based similarity between words. As I mentioned, polarity-inducing LSA. Distributional similarity, very many approaches based on the distributional hypothesis that similar words will tend to occur in similar contexts. And more recently, we've seen a lot of impact from neural language models from Nikolov and Socher and others. There are other attempts at combining word-relatedness measures. So Zhang et al. Had this multi-relational LSA, which does Tucker decomposition, sort of a generalization of SVD over a tensor formed in a similar way. And the key difference with that is, so this is also reported here, the multi-relational LSA, which is not really, it's getting to 78%, but it's a different factorization approach, and it's not quite as effective in this task. So in conclusion, we're able to combine these word-relatedness measures using this tensor factorization in a way that's able to distinguish antonyms, but was a key limitation of distributional approaches. And this is available on GitHub if you're interested.
I'd like to understand a little bit better. When you say direct lookup with WordNet, what does that mean? So if you have a word like cold, are you looking for hot, and how does that work?
Yeah, so there's actually a little bit to it. The full details are in the paper, and as I said, there are multiple interpretations of what lookup would mean in WordNet. But yes, you can map, let's say cold. Cold is your input word. So if we go back to the antonym task, let's say you're given cold. You can ask, okay, what sin sets does it belong to? And now what are the antonym relations for those sin sets. You can also look at what adverbs and adjectives it's related to, or what nouns it's related to as well, and look at what their antonyms are. So that's what we did, and we get, I think, 44% using that lookup technique.
Other questions? I'll ask a question. If I understand your terminology correctly, one of the parts of the tensor is capturing distributional similarity.
Yes.
And another part is essentially capturing polarity.
Yeah, it's, I mean, the only part,
The one that you called perspective.
yes, there are two perspectives on word relatedness. One of them is this manual lexicon, which is giving you synonym antonym relatedness, and the other is giving you distributional relatedness.
Mm-hmm. So that seems like a very nice fit to the antonym problem.
Yes.
Are there other kinds of semantic relations that you think this will extend to, and could you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, a completely different sort of, I don't know if it's completely different, but a very different sort is topic-based similarity. So whereas distributional similarity would look at hot and cold and say that they occur in a lot of the same contexts, or hot and warm, topic-based similarity will say things like doctor and hospital are actually in the same topic, although they don't really occur in the same context. Doctors are subjects of verbs that hospitals are not. So that would be a very different kind of word relatedness.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? Well, then let's thank the author again.
Thank you.